We're a dedicated research unit at the University of Liverpool in the School of Clinical Sciences. We work very specifically on the biological basis of obesity rather than the public health implications per se. We're very particularly interested in fat cells, the cells that store lipid, and their role in particular in inflammation and how what happens in the fat cells leads to the diseases associated with obesity. In a sense, we're part of a broader network of obesity research in Liverpool, which involves people in the psychology department looking at the psychology of feeding behaviour, of people in the more clinical departments who are concerned with hands-on treatment and examination of obese patients, and even people in the veterinary faculty who are interested in obesity in companion animals, which is a growing problem itself. I think it's very serious in public health terms. We're in a situation now where in the UK 1/4 of the adult population are obese, and this is very important because it leads to major increases in the rate of diabetes. Its impacts on coronary heart disease. It even impacts on the development of cancer. And indeed, over the next decade or so, the health consequences of the rise in obesity are really going to be a very major problem, both in government terms and in terms of general public health strategies, but of course, most importantly of all, for all those people who are obese and who appear destined to be obese on current trends. In a sense, yes, in that we have always known what causes obesity, and that is that your intake is greater than your expenditure, and that's the only way you can get obese. We know that, however, in rather more general terms, that the type of diet that we eat, that is generally a high-fat diet of highly palatable, energy-rich foods, is not good news. And the way in which we eat it too, which is increasingly as grazing as we on the move rather than sitting down to formal meals. Equally, we know that we have become increasingly sedentary. Our physical activity levels have been falling, and that relates to a whole series of cultural changes over the last 2 to 3 decades, and we need to increase both exercise and output. So at one level, we know pretty much what will solve the problem. We know also a little bit about genes. They're a genetic predisposition, and some people may have a greater or lesser genetic predisposition. But the effect of environment, in a sense, is layered onto that genetic predisposition. And in the end, in most cases, it's the environment that matters. The body mass index is a very simple tool for defining obesity. It's based on your weight in kilograms, and that's divided by your height in meters squared. And if that's 30 or more, then you are regarded as obese. That's true for those of us in the West. In other populations, particularly in Asia, in China and Japan, BMI of perhaps 25 to 27 is normally regarded as the cut-off point for obesity. It's not a perfect definition, but it's a simple, practical tool which reflects very closely body fat in most individuals. Being fat, however, or fat in the sense of overweight, is having a body mass index between 25 and 29.9 before you hit this critical 30 level in the case of we Westerners. The problem is the large increase or the high increase in the risk of developing the associated diseases, the type 2 diabetes, the coronary heart disease and cancer. And indeed you could argue that being obese, having a high body mass index, might only be seen as an aesthetic issue if it weren't the health consequences of the obesity. So it's the health impacts that matter. That in many ways is the $64,000 question. Groups throughout the world are trying very much to try and work out the links as to what it is about that degree of fatness that increases the risk of diseases. And it seems increasingly likely that it's this process of inflammation in the fat cells that matter, because our fat cells produce a large number of hormones and protein signals that they release. And many of these are increased quite substantially, particularly those that relate to inflammation, when the fat cells increase in size in obesity. And it seems as though at least some of these hormones and protein signals have a direct impact on other tissues in terms of inducing insulin resistance and heart disease. But we don't understand the full mechanistic basis for that, but that's the general proposition that many people are now following. Yes, that's very much so. And this is something that we've only come to recognise in the last 10 to 15 years. Up until the early 1990s, we thought it was simply a fat storage organ, an organ for storing excess energy as lipid. But with the discovery of a hormone called leptin in 1994, and then the discovery of a number of other hormones, we've come to see that it's really a very extensive endocrine gland, and indeed in many ways the largest endocrine gland in the body, because it's the largest organ in the body, certainly in the obese. There is some substance in it. Perhaps I would be hesitant to say it's an excuse, but there is obesity does run in families, and if you have two fat parents, then your genetic predisposition for being obese will be that much higher too. But in most cases, that doesn't guarantee that you'll be obese. There are lifestyle changes and interventions which, at least theoretically, you can take in order to intervene and to minimize the impact of your genes. It's difficult to be absolutely certain why we've had, and to take the UK as an example, a threefold increase in the incidence of obesity over the last 25 years, from 6% of adult men and 8% of adult women in the early 1980s to a quarter of all adults right now. It has to have something to do with lifestyle and affluence. Food, of course, is now really very cheap. It's in the order of 10% of household budget, which historically is extremely low. But we've also had a period, a long cultural period, by that I mean several decades, where there's been much emphasis on reducing physical activity, in the sense of washing up not by hand but putting it in the dishwasher, washing clothes not by taking them down to the river and rubbing them between two stones but putting them in a machine, and so on and so forth. And of course the rise of car ownership, the extent to which more and more of us spend more and more of our time sitting behind computers, either at work or in the form of computer games and at home and so on. It has really been very considerable, and this has been a phenomenon of the last 20 years or so, with growing affluence. So although we can't be certain, those are the sort of indicators that we have. Yes, there are certain genes that are critical for maintaining body fat, and perhaps the most potent example of that is the leptin gene. The leptin gene is a gene that is normally expressed in our fat tissue, and indeed it codes for one of the proteins, the hormones that the fat tissue releases. And this protein does a number of things, but one very important thing that it does is to go to that part of our brain called the hypothalamus, where it inhibits our normal appetite. And if you have a mutation in that particular gene, you don't produce the normal functional hormone, then food intake is rather higher and obesity ensues. And there are several other examples of genes that are regarded as fat genes, in the sense that their loss or changes in their function can result in severe obesity. Well, the pharmaceutical industry has been working very hard for several decades and is still working very hard in order to try and come up with a magic bullet from the point of view of drug treatment. Personally, I'm somewhat sceptical as to whether or not we're going to achieve that. And one very powerful reason for saying that is that the control of body weight is actually a very complex process. And there's a certain redundancy in the control of food intake and energy expenditure. In other words, if you have a drug that hits a particular part of the system, then the system's quite clever. It finds ways of bypassing that, and other systems are called into play. So I am somewhat sceptical as to whether or not we'll find a magic bullet in terms of drug treatment. In the end, I think we're only going to be able to halt, indeed reverse the obesity epidemic, as some would call it, by pretty major lifestyle changes. And in the end, that's going to be down to individuals. There are a number of things that you can try and do yourself in terms of regulating your food intake and increasing your energy expenditure gradually, perhaps at first in the case of the latter. There's no particular rocket science in that, but there is little way out of the basic thermodynamics of why one gets fat and how one reverses that process. Well, junk food is not good news. It certainly doesn't help the fight against obesity, in the sense that junk food tends to be pretty high fat and it tends to be highly palatable, so therefore it's attractive and people can eat large quantities of it. But junk food is not good news from a rather more broader nutritional perspective too, in terms of heart disease, hypertension and so on and so forth. So the message is very simple: avoid junk food. I think the amount that the government can do is somewhat limited. It can deal with issues such as advertising of food and food products to children. It can help to encourage through in school active or physical activity programs and so on and so forth. But I think that ultimately it's down to the individual. Indeed, we all know when we're getting larger, or we should know when we're getting larger, either because we have weight scales in our bathrooms, or because we know what our trouser size is when we put those trousers on in the morning, and whether or not they're getting tighter and so on and so forth. So yes, in a generic sense, there is some role for government, but I think ultimately obesity has to be solved by the individual. What's happening in the developing, industrializing countries is extremely important. China, in particular, is highly sensitized now to the Western type, if you like, health problems that it's beginning to see, and obesity is a growing problem in China. It's attempting to try and learn from what's gone wrong for us, but whether or not it'll be able to achieve that is very difficult to know. At least it has our experience, and it ought to try and see what it can do about that. A simple example of China, of course, is that they have had, or are having, a very rapid move from transport by bicycle to transport by car, and this is likely to have quite a considerable impact on their 24-hour energy expenditure, and therefore the tendency with which they become obese. I'm more optimistic in the sense that I think one must be an optimist that we're going to deal with this problem. But trying to modify eating behavior is extremely difficult, because food is not just nutrition, it's not just chemicals going into the mouth. Of course, there's a huge cultural context in terms of how we see food. Food is something that we used to eat with our families. Food is something that we give to our visitors. Food is something that we go out on special occasions, and perhaps more frequently than that, increasingly, as part of celebration and so on and so forth. So there's a whole mix of cultural values and cultural signals associated with food. So it isn't simply a issue of nutrition, no matter how important nutrition is, of course, fundamentally to what and why we eat. I think that's a possibility, but I'm an optimist, and I think that regulatory systems will, as it were, kick in before we reach anything too dramatic. We've shown in recent decades tremendous flexibility, if I can use that word, in terms of increasing food production. And in the case of the UK, we have a high level of food waste, which is something that we can reduce quite substantially, and therefore, as it were, ease our impact in terms of global food production. And certainly for those of us in the UK, that may be particularly important, as we're now moving into a period where we are importing at least a quarter of the total food that we consume, as opposed to only a few percent 10, 20 years ago.